The first article describes a study whose purpose was to examine the neuropsychological deficits associated with childhood sleep apnea, as well as determining if the neuropsychological deficits are associated with neuronal changes in certain parts of the brain. The researchers hypothesized that sleep disordered breathing would be associated with neuropsychological function in areas responsible for learning, memory, and executive function, while the central nervous system metabolites alteration would be associated with the hippocampus and the frontal cortex. The study was a cross-sectional study of children ages 6 to 16 with moderate to severe obstructive sleep apnea, defined by a apnea and hypopnea index greater than or equal to 8 compared to healthy children. All the children underwent polysomnography and neuropsychological tests. Polysomnography was performed to determine the presence and severity of sleep apnea. The 31 children who met the criteria had a proton MRSI of their brain performed. The study demonstrated that children with obstructive sleep apnea had lower scores than the controls on a full scale IQ, as well as lower performance on executive functions. The proton MSRI indicated abnormal neuronal metabolism in children with obstructive sleep apnea. The alterations were in the hippocampus and the right frontal cortex. This article is interesting because it described a potential association between obstructive sleep apnea and the brain metabolites. More research has to be done to support this association in children, and if there is an association, this could lead to early diagnosis and treatment. This would be beneficial for a child's performance in school and other executive functions. I also thought it was interesting that executive functions affected in children were not the same as executive functions affected in adults. In the second article, researchers were trying to figure out the prevalence of obstructive sleep apnea in children with Down syndrome, as well as the impact of obstructive sleep apnea and sleep structures on their cognitive performance. In a few studies done prior, there seems to be a prevalence between 22 and 79% of sleep apnea in children with Down syndrome, a number that is much higher than that in the general population. The presence of obstructive sleep apnea can result in other health issues and problems with cognitive function. The study recruited children with Down syndrome between the ages of 6 and 18 through flyers at the Taiwan Down Syndrome Foundation. The children were assessed by a pediatrician, otolaryngologist, and a clinical geneticist. Their medical history was taken into account, and if they suffered from certain health conditions, they were excluded from the study. The subjects were then evaluated for habitual sleep-wake time and hours of sleep, symptoms and signs of obstructive sleep apnea such as snoring, mouth breathing, and hyperactivity, as well as the Epworth Sleepiness Scale, measures of cognitive function, 2-week sleep diary, and the PSG. The results came from a sample of 30 children with Down syndrome. Out of the 30 children, 24 had either mild or moderate obstructive sleep apnea, resulting in a total prevalence rate of 80%. The study also concluded that obstructive sleep apnea and percent REM were associated with lower vocabulary and communication, suggesting that these can be associated with language ability. The study demonstrated a large prevalence of obstructive sleep apnea in children with Down syndrome, particularly large in children with between the ages of 6 and 12. I thought this research was interesting because it has to do with children, specifically children with Down syndrome. Knowing that obstructive sleep apnea is more prevalent in children with Down syndrome can help get them treatment faster and deal with other health problems associated with obstructive sleep apnea, such as language ability. I'm interested to see if results are the same in future studies done strictly for children between the ages of 6 and 12. This last article describes a potential treatment for sleep apnea. Since sleep apnea can contribute to other health issues, there has been a lot of research trying to find ways to diagnose and treat it better. Currently, sleep apnea can be treated with surgery but most commonly with the use of the CPAP. However, not everyone can tolerate this. There is no current medication available to treat sleep apnea, but dimethylphenidate seems to show some promise in the experiment. Patients were divided into 2 groups where they were either treated with dimethylphenidate or a placebo for 4 months. polysomnography was performed to determine the change in respiratory disturbance index. At the end of the studies, there seemed to be a decrease in respiratory disturbance index when treated with dimethyl fumarate. I found this article interesting because it presented a potential new treatment to sleep apnea, since sleep apnea can lead to both sleep deprivation and other health issues. If this treatment ends up being successful, it could really help a lot of people.